I'm Kate Wadley. I have been working on this tour for about a year and a half now, and have been working for the... Are you giving me this to hold? Okay, thank you, Jan. And have been working on the Critic and Curator Tour for a number of years. It started in 2011 as a partnership between the University of Oregon and the Ford Family Foundation. It was a modest proposal to research and connect Oregon artists with curators representing many conversations in contemporary art. When we started to put this program together, we couldn't have imagined the breadth and depth of experience the visitors would bring to artists throughout the state, and the new understandings of what's happening here, not only looking outside at what's happening here, but our understanding of what can be and is in all corners of the states. That said, the tour is just one of 7 visionary elements of the Ford Family Foundation Visual Arts Ecology program. They include support for exhibitions, for publications, capital projects, residencies, special opportunities for individual artists. The Ford Foundation Fellowships, a significant and generous recognition of excellence granted to multiple artists on this faculty. Could you guys raise your hands if there's someone who has received a Ford Family Foundation Fellowship? 1, 2, 3. I can't see you guys because of the light. So Jack, Laura, Tanaz, and Anya, your faculty. And last but not least, a new element, a really incredible inaugural 2-day critical writing workshop led last weekend by Vervoort and attended by more than 30 art writers from throughout the state of Oregon, and it was amazing. The Ford Family Foundation team, who guide this constellation of initiatives with exceptional intelligence, care, and generosity, are Candace Brewer-Nunn, Senior Advisor to the Visual Arts Program, who can't be with us tonight. She attended the lecture at the Portland Art Museum, which was also kind of a knockout there. And Carol DeLue, who is with us tonight. And Carol is right down front, right there on the corner. And Carol is the grants manager for visual arts at the foundation. I also wish to welcome Foundation board member Carrie Thompson, way at the back, the first board member that has actually visited one of these lectures, and the president of the foundation, Ann Kubish, and we're very honored and delighted to have her here with us tonight as well, Ann Kubish. Before we introduce Jan, I want to credit Sarah Krajewski, the curator of modern contemporary art, and Stephanie Parrish, associate director of education and public programs at the Portland Art Museum, for their enthusiastic and generous support of the lecture in Portland, and the 4 partner institutions that have so enriched this project since 2015. They are the Cooley Gallery at Reed College, Pacific Northwest College of Art, the Oregon College of Art and Craft, and Portland State University. All of that said, and after 6 years, 18 visitors from throughout the country, nearly 200 studio visits, and a major publication, I have the pleasure of introducing our first international visitor, Jan Verwoert. He is a critic and writer on contemporary art and cultural theory based in Berlin. He teaches at the Piet Zwart Institute, Rotterdam. He is a professor for theory at the Oslo National Academy of the Arts and guest professor at the UDK Graduate School, Berlin. The author of numerous books, journals, essays, and anthologies. Verwoert's writing moves in surprising twists and barely connected turns, from the personal to the public, illuminating the entwined affects, layers, and collisions of art, politics, romantic love, and the sweep of history in writing that is open, honest, and consistently, humanly generous. But more importantly to this audience, and paraphrasing a description of his book, Cookie, Vervoort addresses the forces at the heart of the tragicomedy that making, showing, and critiquing art implicates us in. He honors the basic joys of turning one thing into another and the miracles of rhythm and rhyme that characterize magic in art. About criticism, he makes visible the endless emotional labor of setting the stage for others and gestures toward an ethics of disappointment to battle false expectations and as a way to come to terms with the fact that no matter how you look at it, criticism hurts. Jan Verwoert.
Hey, good evening. And thank you, Kate, for the introduction. And I have to thank everybody involved in getting me over for the absolutely amazing hospitality that I've been enjoying over the last week. And I kind of never take it for granted that people open up their studios to me and start discussing their work with me. And that's just a great thing to experience. When I've never been to Oregon, I didn't even know that this part of the world was called the Pacific Northwest, and then you arrive and immediately you walk into people's worlds, into people's studios, having the thinking, the feeling, the life kind of being open up in their works. And it's, I do it all the time, can't get used to it, and I've been really having a good time so far. I'm also totally overwhelmed by the amount of people being here, so wow, thanks. A week ago in Portland, when I just arrived, I told people, like, my body still currently thinks it's 5 o'clock in the morning. By now, I'm halfway over the jet lag, but if at any point I keep forgetting names and stare blankly into space, that's the moment when you have to fill the gap and shout the name at me that I'm currently looking for, just as a word of warning. Otherwise, I have a lot that I want to share with you. It might not be exactly be a short presentation, but I'm going to keep the introduction even shorter to make sure that I'm not wasting too much of your time. But I always feel before I give a talk, I always feel I owe it to the audience to say a little bit about where I'm coming from, why I talk the way I talk, because I don't think that's something one should take for as a given. I always feel writing as an artist, as an art critic, and probably also as an artist, what you share is a question which, for want of a better term, I would describe with the question of the appeal. Meaning, I write about stuff that appeals to me, shit that talks to me, and I try to not just make sense of what it might say, and not just about how it talks to me, but what it is that makes it appeal to me. And in the same way, I'm assuming an artist would want to make the work appeal to me. I will then appeal to an editor to say, like, I think really we need to publish something about it. And in the act of writing, I try to appeal to the reader to somehow channel that which has appealed to me. So there is a certain kind of magnetism that I feel as a critic you kind of channel, you amplify, and that is to some extent, I believe, what criticism and art might have to do with politics or a general sense of cultural criticism, that at any given moment in time, certain things seem to have a particular appeal. They make you feel like it's urgent to talk about them. So how do you describe these moments of urgencies? I consider that a primary challenge of the critic, of the artist, and very often for any kind of public speaker who seeks to reach an audience, and very often that is what politics is about. It's a key question. What are we looking at? What are we looking at the moment? What are the urgencies that draw us towards particular questions, for better or worse? I think it's maybe something that we inherit from modernity, that we understand that there's always a certain kind of currents running in society, a particular kind of electricity. And the big question is like, who's going to channel and challenge those electricities? Who's going to put a body up there to catch the energies and filter them in such a way that people can connect to them? That may be a question of a speaker, a performer, but I do think as a critic, I also, that is kind of, I wouldn't say my vocation, but that's my task, to make a proposition to an audience as to what it is that seems to have an appeal at this particular moment, that draws things into a particular orbit, what the attractor might be that sort of in contemporary coffee makes the milk kind of stir into a particular direction, if you permit me to use that stupid image. This is why tonight I'm mainly going to talk about the attraction of the fateful. It's a term that I've been, not faith, but fate, that I've been hovering around for a very long time, and I've always found it very difficult to talk about it, and I'm currently trying to find a way to address it, because I feel right now the notion of the fateful seems to play a huge role in politics and in culture in general, and I'm going to try to explain how I see these forces operating. Very often, I believe, when you're looking at these attractors in contemporary culture, these attractors, these moments, these forces that create an appeal, they're not only contemporary. They might be ghosts that have been haunting a culture for a very long time. And so very often understanding these forces that magnetize a discourse turn you into a bit of a ghostbuster, that if there's something strange in your neighborhood, who do you call? Like an intellectual, if you will. And I think the pride of profession for any artist or intellectual would be to a certain degree to understand the magnetism, expose oneself to the magnetism, and that very often means you start kind of tracing ghosts that are haunting the culture back to where they may or may not have come from. So I'm going to go from a particular contemporary debate around the fateful, the fate of a people, back into some places where I've seen that ghost before. Yeah? So I'm going to take you on a ride back to Sicily at some point to see where the ghost of mafia may have come from. Yeah? All of these are tentative attempts. Ghosts don't necessarily materialize in the form of positive fact, but bear with me. I'm going to do a journey in 3 steps. I always feel when the term politics is used in an artistic environment, we owe each other a preliminary definition, just some workable definition of what that may mean. I'm not an expert on this. I'm not a scholar in political sciences. I just want to propose a couple of terms which, based on my experience of being inside political processes, at least I find workable. From there, I want to talk about attractors. Already given my game away, I want to talk about the attraction of the fateful. As I said, that with all the competing ideologies that we find at a given moment in time that tell us what the truth is or what we should be desiring, very often what underpins them, what makes them attractive, is not necessarily their explicit content, but some other oomph that's below them, which I'm trying to describe by talking about the fateful. And in the end, I'm trying to tentatively juxtapose what I find is a right-wing discourse of the fateful, which with something that may be an attempt to reconfigure the fateful from a left-wing perspective, which for me means understanding the life that we live together, the way that we are thrown together in a particular situation as we live through a moment of cataclysmic change, of crisis. How do we describe the fate of being thrown together or torn together? And for me, it has always been very appealing to think about the strange meaning of the term corruption, because literally if rupture means to tear, corruption means to be torn together. So I want to reimagine corruption from a left-wing perspective as a way of imagining what it means to be torn together in a situation of crisis. It's very speculative, but bear with me. And usually I have a habit of taking people along by using lots of visual material. I'm not going to do this tonight. I'm going to be very, very wordy in the beginning, and then towards the end I'm going to bombard you with some selected images. So 2 wordy bits on politics and its underpinning attractors, and then a little bit more of a visual speculation about how we can imagine a state of being torn together in a state of crisis. Introduction. The way how I have been experiencing politics on a very basic, mundane level, also working at universities in different places, is that to some extent politics and political intelligence has a lot to do with mediating between conflicting interpretations of a situation at hand. So it's not just a conflict that different people have different interests, but the arena of politics, when it comes into being, has a lot to do with, and I love the English language for using words like that, entertaining conflicting interpretations. So like politics has so much to do with managing to keep different conflicting interpretations in your head at one point, at the same time, while you're looking at a given situation. For me, I love this song, this break in the famous song, "Stop children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down." For me, that's the birth of politics. Like there is a situation, stop, everybody look what's going down. You're facing a situation, you're in that situation, and now different people may advance a reading what it is that we're currently experiencing, because very often, especially in situations of crisis, it's not entirely clear what's going down. Everybody feels something is going down, but you need a forum in which people can advance their views on what it is they think they're currently experiencing, what they think is at stake, what story could be proposed to explain what's currently happening to you. And the arena in which these different stories may be entertained, I think, is just simply politics. Of course, there is a power struggle which then emerges when different people are looking at the same situation, and that power is simply the power to say what is what. So there is a struggle over who is to say what is what, because in that moment, the playing field may not be entirely flat and equal, because different narratives of how to look at a given situation will seek to dominate each other, because depending on which narrative gets the upper hand, things will be decided in a certain way, decisions will be taken according to the story that seems most appealing as to how a crisis should be understood and hence how it should be resolved. Some people say, oh, it's the foreigners that take our jobs away. So the moment you can convince people that that is the story that interprets the situation at hand, certain decisions will follow. If someone says, yeah, well, without people coming into the country, no one will pay the pensions, that's a bit more of a difficult story, which will lead to other decisions being taken. So this is the moment when in the arena, of course, different narratives struggle with each other, and these narratives are embodied because it's very much also about who is to say what is what, simply identifying how the situation should be read. And in this moment, of course, ideology is a powerful tool, because ideology very often is just a compellingly simple account of what is what, which is easy to repeat for everyone. Yeah, drain the swamp, okay, we got it. Narrative, repeat, and suddenly you have a narrative, while being totally contrafactual, seems to give a certain read on the situation and allows for certain powers to be seized. The Italian philosopher Gramsci gives a very succinct reading of this, saying like, yeah, well, in the end, this fight over narratives is a fight for hegemony, that a particular narrative that's easier to repeat gives you power in society, and hence the left should strive for that hegemony as much as the right does, which means having stories circulate that are relatively easy to understand and relatively easy to repeat, from the children's program to the art review to the teaching. It's important who has the power to say what is what, because it massively influences decisions taken in society. I used to think that this is a too blunt reading of politics. Sometimes right now I think maybe on a certain level it's what one must consider. I grew up in the 70s, and for me the stories that I learned, I took them from Sesame Street, rehearsing a particular kind of story of just curiosity and understanding. So growing up within that narrative, which I have a feeling right now is very much under threat. And so one question that always comes up on a certain level is, which story are we going to be repeating in politics? And in many situations that I've been in recently where certain kind of clashes emerged, of course I was fighting with other people over the right to interpret the situation in a certain way, and I found myself repeating certain stories all over and over, using the blunt tool of ideology to in a hands-on fight over interpreting the situation at hand. So this is just trying to make sense of a certain kind of political reality where the power to propose a story is not just the power to explain, but very much also the power to make people imagine a particular possibility. When some stories are just about imagining people, to imagine the impossibility of relating to others, maybe right now one of the challenge is to create stories that appeal strongly to the imagination and make people imagine possibilities that other stories foreclose. And on that level, contrary, I mean, I'm part of a post-ideological generation, living in Berlin, a city which is probably very much associated with a post-ideological moment. It's just like, let's not have big stories, let's have techno music without vocals. We want to dance, it's all about the body. We don't need the stories. And this is basically where I'm coming from. So while telling you these things, I'm also trying to slowly convince myself to kind of bring the story back, to repeat certain stories, to incite an imagination of other possibilities. All of that, however, is based on a certain assumption, which I think these days we become painfully aware of. Even though politics, to some extent, is always a power struggle, sometimes a vicious power struggle over which narratives will dominate, it is still politics, meaning it is the arena in which certain different readings of a situations are entertained. There is a framework, there is a platform where war as open conflict is bracketed and suspended. I was reminded of that recently with the new rise to power of certain kind of right-wing populist parties also in Germany, and a lot of violence being acted out on politicians in the countryside, when politicians went on the news and said, people, do you understand what politics is? We talk in politics as if we hated each other. We are at each other's throats. Yes, we use ideology to battle each other. That doesn't mean that we are not actually friends and we don't have a beer afterwards. Because after all, this is politics, a moment where war is suspended. It's a forum, and it's an arena where, as the Belgian philosopher Chantal Mouffe said, the direct agony of war is suspended and translated into a game of antagonisms. It's understood that for everybody who is in politics, that while in the game, as in every kind of athletic enterprise, of course, in the game you fight hard, but you do it based on the understanding that it's a game, that the game is on and everybody is committed to being in it. Yeah? And it seems recently there's just a basic lack of understanding that there is such a thing as the game of politics, where it seems it has dissipated and ideology is going back into straightforward war, where it's not opponents in the game, but enemies on the street. So on a certain level, I think this game is important to be reconsidered. We're just losing a very, very basic understanding of politics, that it means, yes, we fight over conflicting reading of a situation, and that is a power struggle, but still we have a medium, a means, a platform on which, like a playing field. It's not you're punching each other in the face. No, you put a ball between each other and then you call it basketball. It's a game, like it's formalized. And I think that form, a sensitivity for that form is being lost, and probably it takes a lot of effort to make people aware of the fact that the game is on, and what it means to be in it. And my looking at how politics sits within the wider horizon of life or urban life, I think politics is a sister game to many other games. For instance, the game of commerce, the game of urban conflict, the game of eroticism, flirtation, and all of these games that are also played with a lot of with a humor that has a lot to do with actually celebrating conflict, which in Yiddish would be called chutzpah, and with a more Irish tonality would be called blarney, or as my Irish students always tell me, Jan, it's not the Americans call it blarney, we call it talking shite, which is a way of saying it's you have a way of calling the other out. You have a way, like the game of politics as commerce or urban conflict, it's about provoking the other to get into the game. In the full awareness that it takes a certain kind of implicit consent that, yes, the game is on. We are somehow testing our forces against each other. So a lot of forms of urban culture share that implicit sensitivity with politics. And when I say commerce, I always feel in recent years it's necessary also to make a distinction between capitalism and commerce. Commerce is just the fact that, yes, people like to trade with each other. They try to fool each other. They try to cheat on each other. Say like, I've got my friend. I have something to sell to you. What do you want to have? And what can you give me? It's a game that people play, trying to understand where the other is coming from, creating difficult situations, which is then theirs to resolve. And it's trading goods. It's drawing each other into fights. It's flirtations on the street. It's all these games that people play to get in touch with each other and create these platforms of urban life which form a city. The term city in Greek is polis, so politics comes from the games people play in the polis. And so I feel like, yes, as the games of politics, games are played in the city, I would include commerce, trading, urban conflict, I'll get to that, and all these other forms. On that level, trade and conflict are actually infinite resources of a city. People trade with each other, people fight with each other. So I think, especially in very family-oriented societies, we know that every family is a nuclear reactor that permanently produces conflict. And why would you not take the fight in the family out to the street? So that's how families relate to each other in a city, in busy traffic. They curse each other. This conflict is a motor that a city thrives on. I just... last year, I had a fantastic conversation with a senior student in the academy at Oslo called Rara Omazat, who was coming from Kabul in Afghanistan to study in Oslo. And he was saying, Kabul has never been a peaceful place, but it should be understood that there is a big, big difference between conflict as something that is part of the life of the city, a game that the city plays with itself, and the same conflict exploited as a resource by people who arm and fuel that very conflict to make money of it. So he was saying, Kalashnikovs don't grow in the mountains. There will be a third party who has understood that exploiting conflict within a city is even more profitable than exploiting commerce. So I forgot to say that before. For me, kind of capitalism is an exploitation of commerce in the same way that arms trade is a way of exploiting conflict. So trade and conflict is a resource. It's always kind of there. The question is just, at what point does a third party move in to skim off the profits? Everybody is dealing, but capitalism, for instance, is a system that makes sure that when everyone's dealing, the profit just ends up in the pockets of few rather than many. In the same way, when everybody's naturally fighting, the profits of that get skimmed off by particular people who have a strong interest in fueling and arming conflicts, because at the end of the day, it's far more profitable than just exploiting trade. And so I think we've reached a moment right now where a lot of people have realized that it's much more profitable to butcher the cow rather than to milk it. And conflict is an urban growth industry. It's also a growth industry, but it's a growth industry where conflict is fueled from all sides to an extent that we're actually moving towards something that is capitalism without commerce. We might be facing the situation that capitalism no longer exists, because when it has relied for long term on milking the cow, right now it's just moving straight forward to butchering it. Yeah? So when the new motto of the day is isolationism, like lots of countries breaking with the very idea that commerce would be necessary, and in the place of commerce we have a direct exploitation of conflict. And I don't know, for want of a better word, this new system could be... because I believe it's no longer really capitalism, I would just call it high-octane feudalism. So a particular way, and usually like these situations, they are brutally obvious, and there's this kind of strangely, bizarrely telling image of the current commander-in-chief putting his hands on the earth. I'm going to talk more about this. And I think the particular brutality of a system that exploits and fuels conflict rather than milking trade is, while capitalism is a gamble that encourages people to gamble, this kind of flat, empty, void resemblance of what that may have been is so much about turning people from players into gladiators, I would say. And for me, a player would usually, while being in a game, would have a certain number of cards on his or her hand. Well, I feel the brutality of the current situation is that everybody gets exactly one card, while the person who's dealing keeps the others and actually stashes away most of the deck on a tax paradise, Cayman Islands, whatever. So the current situation is that we have someone says, no, we're still playing capitalism, but no one realized that the deck is gone. The game is no longer on, the game is gone, which, apart from being slightly fraudulent, gives you a situation that you have a lot of desperation of everyone running around with exactly one card, trying to make sure to get that one card into a game which actually no longer exists. And you can check on Facebook which other card the other person is having, like, oh, maybe this is the better card. Oh my God, I'm so jealous. If I only had that card, I would be so much better off. Yeah? But it doesn't relieve you from the desperation of being stuck with that one card. The sociological term for that is precarity. Yeah? Like you're running around, it's like, I have my talent, I have my brains, I'm the German guy who can talk. This is my card, so I want to make sure that I put that card in the game somewhere. And the desperation comes from the fact that neither is there commerce nor is there politics. The game is gone. Yeah? So we end up being these kind of existential Facebook gladiators, trying to make sure that this one game that no longer exists is what should be on, and that we want to get our card back in it. So I think a first proposition I want to make is maybe we need to escape from being the single card gladiators and make sure that on all levels somehow we bring the game back on. And that might be a game of commerce, a game of conflict, something that is based on a common awareness that there needs to be a platform, an arena, where what otherwise is just pure war is translated into a formalized conflict of provocations, elicitations, and where you try to kind of meet the other in this field of desires that has a particular court, a playing field on which there's more than one card for everyone. Yeah? So that's the first proposition that I want to make. One idea that I have about what this very simple, basic playing field could be, and I'm not proposing any kind of universal notion of humanism in a divided society, but I think in very charged environments I've experienced the possibility of putting the urban game back on, and that is road rage in bad traffic. So as something that the city will simply not unlearn, and which is, I'm going to get to that in a second, which is rudeness, what I want to call convivial rudeness. And I once had that experience I was teaching in Tel Aviv for a bit, and there is a very busy area between Tel Aviv and Jaffa, the former Arab port city, which is traditionally a textile district in between the two cities. And I was sitting there with some friends and having a tea, and then I saw an old guy right into the busiest possible traffic with one of these bikes that they have there. And these bikes are used to transport fabrics, so they're overladen with these fabric rolls. And he was riding into the busiest traffic, producing an enormous provocation. Everybody was honking their horns off, and the guy was just very gently blessing everybody. And it just occurred to me that the new fuck you is just bless you. And it was entirely unclear which of the two locally available divinities he was invoking. Yeah? It was kind of beyond that. Bless you all, me and my bikes have been around in this neighborhood for centuries before you stupid cars even arrived. Yeah? And so I don't know what this is about. Bless you all. And for me, that was the way of bringing the game back on, of evoking a spirit of urban conflict in the kindest possible way. I once told that story in Chicago, and a student with an Asian background said, her grandfather always did that. He never learned to speak English, and whenever he went through customs and immigrations, he just went, hallelujah, and everybody went, amen. Yeah? So it's a cheeky way of bringing the game back on, not from a higher ground. You're not preaching because you're actually a body stuck in traffic. So you actually, the entanglement has reached a maximum, and from within that entanglement, you reach out and say but listen, people, after all, this is a game, and that game is called Tel Aviv. This is what the city is, that very game. You're invoking the God of the city. You're praying to that God which makes the city as terrible as it is, and everybody who's in it must acknowledge that, yes, we are all at the service of that dysfunctional divinity. I remember Stephen Colbert commenting, or was it Trevor Noah, on this figure saying, but in other parts, this would just be saying, welcome to New York. Yeah? This is the joy of a particular convivial rudeness that brings the game back on, which I would like to link to another cultural concept, and which is that of the urban grotesque. The grotesque that kind of, in a way, puts the body into play, but it would be wrong to say the grotesque is invoking human nature. It's invoking the fact that everything that is up can also fall down, that someone who acts like an asshole can be in a position to be someone dishing out a blessing, that after all, we shouldn't be too sure of a particular hierarchy, and that is what brings us together in the human mess that we're in. Somebody who writes very beautifully about the grotesque, and whom I'm paraphrasing here, is Michal Bakhtin in the book Rabelais and His World, where he talks about the true social realism being Billingsgate, the language of the fish market, where everything can be debased and lifted up, where values are out for grasps, and that is the game that you play on the fish market. One of the gods that he brings up, this is one Greek goddess of the grotesque, which I sometimes find is fun to share, and her name is Baubo. Baubo used to be a maid of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, and when Demeter was sad because her daughter Persephone ran away with Hades to the underworld, to cheer her up, Baubo exposed her genitals to her and pretended her lower part of the body was her upper part, so that her crotch was her face, so that everything that is down is up, which is basically also what you do when you flick a finger at somebody. It's just that there's a particular kind of genital humor that turns the world upside down and in this moment revivifies it. Says, like, actually we are still alive. So Bakhtin interprets it as a very vivacious affirmation of the ways of life. Sometimes goes up, sometimes it goes down. So whatever is up goes down and down goes up. And that being the principle of life, which in that moment is vivaciously invoked through grotesque, obscene humor. And the statue that you see on the side is actually a children's toy, like an action figure, if you will. It's like people would play with it to remind themselves that with this playing figure, yes, that's the game of life, and it's on. And one way to celebrate it is through convivial obscenity. It's about jokes. Yeah? At the same time, of course, there is a painful awareness when the game is off, and certain the conflict that would allow you to make rude jokes about each other becomes no longer possible. When there are certain jokes you simply cannot tell. I remember certain times when you were going through immigration in the US, it was totally clear, make no jokes. Not even a joke about the fact that you cannot joke about bombs. Like the moment we would be out. Yeah? In the same way that obviously when historical disasters occur, you can no longer joke about the other and you cannot make the joke of the other. Over the years, I've had so many fantastic jokes told to me by Jewish colleagues, which I cannot repeat because I'm German. I cannot tell the joke of the other. Because in that moment you realize that certain historical tragedies are so fundamental that I cannot make that joke. I had a kind of a fantastic conversation with a Kurdish cab driver in Berlin the other day, and he was telling me lots of Kurdish jokes, saying, like we suffer so much, but what would it be if we couldn't joke about our fate? And I have a feeling, yes, this is your fate. I couldn't tell you these excellent Kurdish jokes. Yeah? Which is, I think, this is the barrier that is usually left over by where a historical wound is perceptible because you cannot tell the joke of the other. Not the joke about the other, but really the joke that the other tells. And that's why I have infinite admiration for Seth Meyers and his colleagues Amber Ruffin and Jenny Hagel for bringing on this skit jokes that Seth can't tell. I'm sure you're familiar with that, where he basically says, I'm a straight white guy. There's certain jokes I cannot tell, even though my joke writers actually proposed them to me. And then one goes, yeah, I'm black, and the other says, I'm gay. And then they tell these jokes, and in the end, the punchline is always that they encourage him to tell one of their jokes, and then they tell him off for telling it. And I find, for me, this is just pure urban intelligence, to say, how can we get a game going around the very limits of the game, which is the joke of the other, the jokes that Seth can't tell. This is exactly kind of bringing the game back on in a situation where it should actually be fundamentally impossible. This is the good stuff, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah? Let me move to the second part, and I'm already taking a lot of time, but second and third part will hopefully roll into each other very quickly. What's the opposite of a humor, an ethos of urban conflict? Urban conflict is very existential if you will. It's this sense of being torn together, being stuck in traffic together. Well, is it jokers to the left, to the right, stuck in the middle with you? That's the existential situation of traffic. This big question of what does it mean to be existentially stuck with each other is a question that has a particular history, and a history that was particularly tangible at the beginning of the last century, when for the first time the urban life of the masses within that construct of the nation state was becoming painfully obvious that something's going wrong. So a lot of people being stuck in a city together, be it Paris, be it New York, be it Berlin, trying to figure out what does it mean that we are under relatively artificial conditions, being stuck in a factory, that we spend time together, that we seem to be living our life together, when the only explanation might be that someone says, oh, it's because you need to earn money, and someone else says, oh, because you are German, because you are American, and people would say, like, I don't even know what that means, yeah? Coming from different places together. So being thrown together, being torn together in one place, experiencing the alienation of modern life, that it's not apparent why it is exactly that you're running to the family and wasting all that lifetime on earning your livelihood. The question of the time of life, the time we live together, became very existentially tangible. It's simply the question of why do we live together and why do we die together? If we're not one family, I'm not related to you, I'm not related to you. I don't know, you are Irish, you are Polish, you are Finnish, whatever. What the hell are we doing in New York? What is this that binds our fate? Same thing was happening all over Europe, where people in this newly constructed nation state had a hard time understanding what it means to live and die together. So in that moment, a particular vocabulary is born that interprets that situation at hand. Situation at hand being a lot of people asking themselves, why are we living and dying together? What is the truth of our time of life? Where I think from this time we inherit two conflicting rhetorics from the left and the right. To interpret, to produce a story that explains the value of the time of life, the left started saying, well, the time of life is about progress. As we get older, we seek to become better. Yeah. This is all about embetterment, improvement. Yes, we are stuck together. We have a lot of problems, but the way how we should understand the manner in which we spend time together, we do it to improve ourselves together through education, social justice. That's called progress. Yeah, that's the destination of humanity, is to proceed getting better, while the right was always quick to understand that another very compelling answer is no, it's fate. Yeah? It's not because we're going to get better, but because we're fatefully tied to each other. I'm going to get to that in a moment. On the left, I think the progress narrative is very hard to beat or very hard to kill. I don't know if when you're watching the news with the recent election of the governor of New Jersey, Mr. Murphy, the first thing that he said when he came forward after the election says, yes, we are better than this. Yeah. So bringing in this, yes, we can progress, yes, we can change, we are better than this, where the answer to the people is, well, what brings us together is a collective desire for self-improvement. We are better than this, we can be. While on the other hand, the answer is always, we are doomed in this together, yeah? Which has a particular form of fatal attraction, where the discontent of the narrative of progress is always, if you tell people you can improve, you always make them feel there's something lacking about them. Yeah, it's like in a bad relationship situation. When you had a bad day, you come back home and your lovely partner you say, you know, I had a bad day. I was so tired, and my colleague sucks so much. It's so terrible, and your partner is gracious enough to tell you, oh, maybe, darling, you should go to sleep early today, and then finally tomorrow have the conversation that you've always been avoiding, and it makes you feel worse. Yeah? It's like if the solution for making it better is so clear, and I have not already arrived at this solution, that probably means I'm stupid or lazy, and since I haven't done it today, it's probably actually my fault that I had a bad day. Yeah? So in the same kind of vicious cycle that by pointing out the obvious solution to people without actually sharing a sense of crisis first, chances are that you make people actually feel worse, and on top feel it that it's their fault that they kind of feel inadequate, which is, I know it from like kind of trying to be a benevolent pedagogue. This is sometimes what happens. This is when you become unbearable. And say, yes, you can be better. Is there anything wrong with me? Yeah? Is it my fault that I'm having a bad day? Well, the right, by saying we are doomed in this together, has always, I mean, my partner grew up in Italy under Berlusconi. It's like, yeah, we are doomed. Everybody cheats on taxes, of course. And everybody hates the government. So elect me as president because I cheat on taxes just like you. I'm a freak like you. I cheat on everyone like you. Why don't you make me the president of government so I can cheat on the government on your behalf? So there is a sense of not going for the good, but going for the fatal bond, the fatal attraction of being bad together. To say, after all, it's just human nature. That's our fate. We are not good. We are bad. We're bad in this together. And by embodying that, I actually make you feel relieved. Because as long as I'm putting you under pressure to say, you should be so much better, you're pretty stressed out. The moment that I make you feel like, no, it's just totally perfectly all right to be a creep. You have a certain part of the population behind you feels like, oh my God, finally it's out. Yeah? So this is a strange sense of fatal attraction giving license as an attractor versus kind of creating a moment of aspiration that should be binding people together. And it feels that these might be two conflicting attractors in the game at the moment. In constant attempt from the side of from the left, to rekindle the aspirational attraction, battled by this kind of troll spirit of provoking. It's like, I'm so stupid, look at it, I can't even spell kind of diversity, to just get people wound up, while constantly signaling, on the other hand, we share a common fate. Of course we're going to go to hell together, and let's go right back to that hell, even if it means bringing coal back, yeah? Which is going to kill anyone working in it. Yeah? Which in itself, this rhetoric of the fateful does have a long history, which dates back as far as I can reconstruct, and this is the ghost-busting bit, to some of the ultra-conservative discourses that you find in a lot of different countries just after the turn of the last century, but prominently also in Germany. I'm just going to give two quick examples. One is the historian Oswald Spengler, who wrote this kind of terribly thick, cheesy book called The Decline of the West. And the other is going to be Martin Heidegger, which I'm going to get to in a moment. Yeah? They kind of pioneered this idea that actually the fateful is the inherent logic of a culture. And coincidentally, a lot of the arguments that you find these guys proposing, they're coming back today in the rhetoric of the alt-right. And I think the alt-right term, if I'm not entirely wrong, is race realism. This idea of saying, like, I'm not a racist. I'm just thinking each people should live and die their own live and death. Let's keep it separate. Yeah? Nothing against you, but I have a feeling you should be on a different track towards your own life and death. People are just different. Cultures are just organically different. They are fatefully divided, if you will. And if you want to study one of the origins of that kind of sick form of reasoning, Oswald Spengler might be one of the pioneers, because in the spirit of the time, he was looking at cultures through organicist metaphors, trying to say, like, each culture is like an organism, and each organism has its own physiognomy, its own life. It blossoms at a certain point, it reaches its peak, and then it will kind of crumble and find its fulfillment in death before everything goes full circle. The strange part of that logic is that while it invokes life and the organic, it's actually totally moribund or morbid, if you will. Because it's that strange idea that cultures find their organic fulfillment in death. So that living together means, like, for a people to realize its destiny, its fate, they must go down together in a blaze of glory at best. Yeah? So a lot of what then happened in the Second World War, at least spiritually, was prepared by people actually seeking in all of this confusion and uncertainty as to how to understand their fate, would be willingly buying into a patriarchal death cult. Yeah? To basically say, we have a leader to tell us what our destiny is, and that actually means what our death is, how we shall all be united in going down, going under together, which is an argument that actually someone like Martin Heidegger did propose, among other things, in his famous book Being and Time, Sein und Zeit, where he comes up with this idea of Entschlossenheit, resoluteness, where you resolve the question of your fate by, in a resolute way, committing to your own death. So basically, whatever you got as the kind of cheesy existentialist pickup line, like, you know, baby, everyone needs to die their own death, and watch me die. Yeah? This is basically a kind of a watered-down version of this idea of, like, how shall we understand what destination to give to our destiny? It's through embracing your own death. And I always forget to look it up. What's the Metallica song? My lifestyle equals my death style? What's the line? You know what I mean? There's a lyric somewhere. It's exactly this idea. To live resolutely, decidedly, with rigor, means to fully embrace the possibility of your own death. It is in the death that your life will find resolution. And in that sense, Heidegger actually writes already in Being and Time that each people needs its heroes to make the possibilities of their death apparent to them, because the hero is the one that goes to the limit resolutely, embraces his mostly death, and thereby writes the story of the people coming back from the limit, and whatever is history and fate is written through that possibility of a heroic death that unites the people. So it's existentialism as a heroic death cult, if you will, which had a strong attraction, a magnetism at people at the time, because it gave them a strong and simple story to interpret the time they would live together. Yes, stand together, die together, and embrace. If it's preferable to existential uncertainty to have the uncertainty of a shared death. And I have no other explanation for the fact that my grandfathers, who were both working class boys, were actually voting for a man who was selling their ass to the industry, being Hitler. So my grandfather didn't have time to be very emotional or irrational, because he was a baker boy and working his ass off day and night. But in that situation of insecurity, where a lot of people in Germany were locked out from the factories, they were jobless, one thing that could give them a purchase on their own destiny was the certainty of someone who asked them, do you want total war? And everyone would scream yes, because in that moment, rather than taking the risk of an open future, you would at least have a purchase on your own death. You actually authorize the decline, the demise of your own class by that's him and his best friend, by entering that party. My grandfather never really entered it, but his best friend did. They sent him into the war, and I don't know, he didn't make it for very long. I think after a month he was gone, and had successfully inscribed himself into the big narrative of the death cult that for a moment gave him kind of proud destination. Yeah? And it's a white man's history, but I can't help thinking about, like, why would the poor vote for the rich and why would the cow vote for the butcher if not to authorize their own fate as being preferable to embracing an unsure future of improvement. That's the fatal attraction of that kind of story. Yeah, you got sold. Last thought. Is there any way to get out of that false alternative of progress left and fate on the right? To get there, let me briefly invoke another ghost of the birth of the mafia. There's many narratives as to how and why that happened, but some seem to be strangely resonant with the idea of the poor embracing precisely those of whom they know that they may actually make life worse for them, but through being very close and identifiable as one of theirs would actually make the common fate more bearable, which, if you look at it, is one story that could be told about the origin of the mafia in Sicily. And I always get my dates wrong, I'm sorry, the 19th century, there was a push within Italy towards reunification to turn the country into a republic, which it hadn't been. It had essentially been two different countries, if not actually a patchwork of many small ones, with the north being more industrialized, with the south being completely rural and basically almost still feudal. And in the south, this feudal order had slowly been crumbling, so that the local accepted rulership, the aristocracy, the landed gentry, they had lost a lot of their capital and influence and power. They were already weakened, which gave the reformers of the north, among them famously this guy Garibaldi, a chance to move his troops into the south and invade the south and declare it part of a unified republic. Together with a hopeful message of, yes, we can, you shall no longer be serfs, you shall be citizens. Hey, big improvement, you are free to be citizens with rights now because we're all part of one big republic. Which in essentially should be good news, but for the people in the south basically meant there's a guy from the north coming here telling a story of progress, and all we can see is him marching in with his troops, producing an enormous interruption of local life, and probably not even being very understandable in his promises, because knowing the huge difference between dialects in Italy, it's pretty possible that people literally didn't understand what the guy was talking about. Yeah? So you have a new order being established in the sign of progress, but lacking the basic translation that would make people feel that this new authority is halfway credible. So you needed a translator to make people feel they accept this as being their new fate, when the problem is, of course, the language already says, you are from somewhere else. Why should we entrust you with our fate? And so this problem was preliminarily solved by bringing in people who the locals would accept as legitimate authority and legitimate representatives of the new order, which happened to be people who were good with guns and who were already organized, which were the local criminal circles, like the bands of the gangs, the local gangs, who would then be recruited by the new order as not just the surrogate police, but the surrogate aristocracy, if you will. So where the previously credible authorities had been out of the same peasant stock, they just ended up on top as the local princes and princesses. After they were gone, you would need something that is a possible stand-in and surrogate for what you had just lost. So it's second-hand aristocracy that makes people feel if the new fate is to be ripped off, they'd rather be ripped off by the devil they know than the devil from the north they fear. Which gives you a situation where, in principle, a system is installed in the key of a shared fate that makes people embrace their own dispossession, if you will. But a dispossession by someone you know rather than a stranger who tells you a strange tale of progress. And again, it's a white people's tale, if you will, but I think it has certain kind of repercussions in the stories that we're witnessing at the moment. When radical, unsettling moments of progress, we have globalization, we have climate change, no one knows what our fate is and all of that. It's really disconcerting. So it interrupts life as it has always been. Things will be different. Yeah? And in that moment, corruption promises to seal a wound created by interruption. It is that which pieces it together, making say like, yes, of course we know that we're doomed, but at least we can collectively sign our dismissal. Visually speaking, what I find is another cue one can take from the mafia history is that the corruption which promises to heal the wound comes with a particular aesthetic, and that is that of surrogate aristocracy. Everyone knows that you're not dealing with the old royals. This is second-hand royalty with which you can still play that particular game that you used to play, but which otherwise would no longer be possible. So I think this high-octane feudalism that we're witnessing now, taking its cues from that mafia, putting an aristocracy, a money aristocracy, in the place of pseudo-credible rulership, is marked by a particular aesthetic, which is the empire of the tacky, if you will. I have a friend from Miami who always says, like she says, like tacky. It's the empire of the tacky. That's for me. That's the thing. Like it's high octane feudalism. You see its traces by having the mafia, a pseudo organicism, a pseudo royalism that has a particular kind of campiness to it. Yeah, it's right wing camp. It's Liberace Nazi stuff. But it takes its cue from a particular thing. This is the series Comorra, which I was talking to it about these things to a friend who said, like, watch that series, it's all about the golden sofa. That's the particular claim to the fateful entanglement and the corruption. It emanates in this thing which is clearly a stand-in, a surrogate, but has its particular attraction around that, and you know where that leads. A particular form of trashiness that becomes relatable because people kind of know this is not indigenous royalty. This is kind of the local crooks, but still the language they speak is something you can relate to because it gives you a sense of being trashy in this fate together. I'm trash, you are trash, so we have trash royalty, if you want. And trash royalty, that this is the Russian oligarch version of that poses as organic when everybody can see through it and embrace it at the same time. Everyone knows there is no Father Christmas. That's why it's so much more fun to be waiting for him at Christmas. So this is not royalty. These are just crooks, but at the same time it's fun to pretend that they are what you would need to feel you're not left alone in your own trashiness. Yeah. And in that sense, like Russian election meddling, well, it's the same model of governance that's being introduced, and it has the same look and relatability to cue yourself into a what if that was shared when it's actually easy to access. Can one enter on that level of existential camp if that position would seem to be the empire of the trashy entirely occupied by the right, if you will? And what I wanted to say before is what is so difficult to beat about the radical right is not that it would be particularly irrational, it's existential. it talks to people, it gives people a narrative of what it means to live and die together, and renders it accessible to this kind of a particular kind of trashy existentialism, the mafia baroque, if you will. What do we have if we run through the images on the left that would actually give us a possible purchase on this sense of being trashed together? Let me just give you 2-3 examples to bring us back to the question, can we perform the existential grotesque? One example was road rage. Now I'm going to try to do the mafia-style thing. On the one hand, one painful question, so I'm probably going to take another kind of 5, 6, 7 minutes of your time. I know the air is running out, but it's going to be images. Something that I experience as a challenge that is associated with this idea of the existential grotesque is that in the past, on the left, it's mainly been patriarchs that could perform the existential grotesque, meaning men who could, on the one hand, embody the narrative of improvement, but who could, at least to the male part of their constituency, at the same time perform this kind of sense of trashy solidarity, saying like, I want us to be better, but actually I am as bad as you. So basically a way of having it both ways, of playing, I'm the bad boy just as you would want it to be, as you fear you are, while I'm actually promising you I can make it better, and by the way, I'm kind of Boston royalty. Yeah. So these are these charismatic figures of the left which could play it both ways in a way that designated them as these charismatic patriarchs, if you will. You've got your Kennedys, and I guess thinking through my own national imaginary, I came up with Willy Brandt, one of these kind of, you have a German chancellor playing the Marlboro Man, sort of a playboy left-wing chancellor, who was nevertheless the guy who kind of, by virtue of being this charismatic figure, went off script while he was in Warsaw and did perform this kneel in front of the statue of the unknown soldier, which in that moment was against any Cold War protocol, and maybe for the history of my people, the first kind of official, like a very strong sign of saying, we are ashamed, so sorry. And it took probably the charisma of somebody like that to say, like, screw it, I'm going off script, and performing this sense of entanglement that carries the depth of that history. So, and in current politics, it sometimes feels it would be so necessary to have someone who would perform a left-wing sense of indebtedness, of owing something by going off script, and not just playing the good guy saying we can be so much better. No, we were bad and there is a problem and I partake in it. And I can do these moves because it's part of the persona that I have already created. The problem is, on the left, the figure, and I also know it from the curatorial field, all the Harald Seemanns of this world, they were improvers who had the charisma of the bad boy. Which is something, I believe, that is fundamentally over. Patriarchy is on the way out. We see a particular kind of backlash that tries to defend it. So I feel these charismatic figures are a thing of the past. The question is, how can we reimagine that from a post-patriarchal perspective? And I think in terms of contemporary speculations on attractors, on appeals, I do think there is a reason why Game of Thrones is so appealing, because it tries to imagine female leadership, but not just by virtue of the idea of the good woman, but a badass mother, creating kind of the possibility of credible leadership. What is a good leader, good female leader, who's not forced to be good? This is what this kind of series tries to imagine, and I think it's part of it's a common task of the imagination, if you will. How can we imagine a post-patriarchal charisma of the badass mother leader? Yeah, it's one of the big tasks of the current imagination, I think, that wrests it back over to a sense of, yes, we are stuck together, like we are not good with each other, but that thing could go back into a game where this not being good being corrupted with all these kind of desires that make up human life, could still result in the search for something to be called social justice. I mean, Khaleesi is not nice. She comes with a lot of pretty fierce dragons, but she's seeking justice. What would it mean to be seeking justice, not pretending that one is good, and succumb to this desire of being, I'm the good boy, I want your love, making everybody feel bad about not living up to the promise of being as good. And I think there's something to be found in that imagination, which may be an artistic task of the time, if you will. Can we imagine that form of social justice in the key of allowing human corruption? In my own visual tradition, I feel thinking the camp grotesque in a key of a fate that is not just that of race realism, but a fate shared in the key of fateful difference. It's something that brings me back to someone like Werner Fassbinder, who actually was looking at Douglas Sirk's form of melodramatic camp and did a kind of adaptation of all that heaven allows in the same kind of fundamentally camp color scheme in his movie Angst essen Seele auf, Fear Eats the Soul, where the bohemian and the good mother meeting in Douglas Sirk becomes Emmy and Ali, a Moroccan immigrant worker and a German widow, meeting one fateful night, rainy night, in a bar, and being united by this chance and having to prove their love against everybody who's trying to tear them apart. What's so beautiful about Fassbinder, that he speaks the language of a kind of working class sense of being, torn together. It's not like you have too many choices, while at the same time he doesn't use that to just preach the same old division, but tries to, from the basis of that, the trashiness of life as it is, and all these kind of love and death is usually pretty melodramatic. It always kind of feels like there's cheesy music playing in the background when these things happen. He takes it exactly from there, but reimagines the fate not as the union of the already same, but a particular possibility of living that other fate in trashy Munich. And I can't help thinking, when I think about kind of someone like MIA, this is from the clip Bad Girls Do It Well, that it's not like she's speaking a Fassbinderian pop, but she speaks golf trash, reimagining another idea of what high-octane feudalism, fateful, could live like if you take it from the position of that style, it's also mafia pop, if you will, but consecrated and dedicated to something, a way more fluid imagination. I'm sure you've all seen that clip with the guys riding these white cars on their two wheels through the desert, and it's you take it where it's at, but you spin it into a completely different direction, opening up this idea of being torn together to a sense of possibility, while not denying that it's not necessarily about like high taste or something like that. Someone, and I'm going to end on that example, who at least in the Italian tradition before Berlusconi was a quite popular leftist figure who spoke existential corruption fluidly, but in the sense not of a death cult that brings the people together in the common decision to die together, but actually in the sense of a vivaciousness of, in that struggle, when life becomes trash, you still struggle together and open it up to possibility, is actually Pasolini, who was, when I listened to my partner's parents speak, who was revered as a common intellectual while being openly queer, but in reimagining the fate of the people in the key of the fateful corruption, but open to a sense of having to somehow live this life together along a trajectory that is not necessarily already prescribed, and it's certainly not the union in death, but a struggle for life, which is beautifully embodied in the protagonist of his movie, Mama Roma, who's a prostitute working the streets, but in that sense, she is Rome. She is the spirit of Rome struggling to get by after the war, and she talks to everyone on the street. She embodies the desperate thirst for life that holds that city together as she's kind of struggling to get by. And the movie is pretty gritty. It's not as romantic as I'm trying to, no, I'm not trying to, I'm hopefully not trying to, but as I might make it sound here, it's a way of being down with the crisis, and from that moment of being down with the crisis, of being in that corruption together, in that trashiness together, formulate an aesthetics of possible change and life rather than death. That's the tentative note on which I would like to end, and I thank you for bearing with me through this workshop. If I haven't exhausted the air in the room already, anyone who wants to leave, anyone, I'm very happy to take questions and would actually be happy for you to throw something back at me. So anyone who wants to stay, please do. And yeah, but if you don't mind, can we just gonna let people who want to leave get out, and then, yeah. Yeah, we don't. This is the only one that we have, and I hope this is not going to produce huge feedback, but I'm going to.
So, thank you, Jan, for a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it, and I find your presentation very compelling. I want to thank my colleagues for bringing you. I found especially compelling the appeal of your idea of bringing the game back. And at one point you talked about also the polis. You used the term polis, and your images of illustrating the game is in fact showing the common space of the city, right? So in some ways I interpreted your bringing the game back as also bringing the polis back. Yeah. And so I'm very much reminded of the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who talks about very much the polis as the space of freedom, of free speech between free individuals. And I want to ask a slightly challenging question because I found this model of freedom and play, right? There's a space of openness. I found this to be slightly incompatible with the grand narratives that you were presenting both on the left and the right? So in some ways I'm feeling the tension between a space of openness and these type of grand historical narratives that have actually in common their desire to make history. And so in this sense, I'm absolutely Arendtian. She's very critical of these huge, grand history. And then you move toward showing these potential models of non-patriarchal leaders, right? And I was so intrigued because you showed women. And I was thinking about Hannah Arendt also as a woman, of course, and also the sense of leaders as people who are doing simply heroes who do good deeds and speak just words. And that is to say, not leaders who promise to insert the helpless, fragile human being into some kind of grand historical narrative, be it progress or doom. There is no religious kind of mythic narrative on that sense, but simply something about doing good things for the people she loves, right? Something like that. So.
Thank you. It's true. I sometimes don't put my cards on the table. I was pretty much lip syncing Hannah Arendt secretly, and the whole idea of politics as a field of encounter where I call the other out in a manner that you wouldn't be able to call yourself out. It's just, for me, like working in Tel Aviv for a bit, I always thought about before that as a peaceful exchange, and then being there, also spending a lot of time in the south of Italy, understanding that can actually be a culture of shared conflict. So my partner always says it's about talking with your hands in the face of the other, as a way of saying, "Do you feel me? Can I have your energy, please?" That is something that Arendt doesn't necessarily go into, and I feel like I in lip syncing her, I wanted to add a little bit more grit to it, like a kind of a gritty, urban, kind of conflictual situation where you realize, no, very often what the city is not peace, needs is not peace, it's proper conflict, meaning but conflict in which you don't have someone throwing in AK-47s or Kalashnikovs to reap the benefit of that conflict. Yeah? To understand, like, people have understood that this conflict, which is politics, like, hey, who are you? What are you saying? Are you talking to me? This kind of thing is also a resource that can be milked. People have understood that. Yes, totally Hannah Arendt attempt to kind of read kind of urban conflict or rudeness. I haven't spent much time in New York. I have a big problem living in Berlin because they also, like, I'm coming from a part of Germany where you are kind of more jovial and friendly to each other and tell stupid jokes, and Berlin is pretty rude. Yeah, but I'm arguing against my own bed and my own nature in a way, but it's something I'm trying to learn, this kind of understanding the polis in an Arendtian sense, but bring in some kind of convivial rudeness into it as an energetic principle. I think in Tel Aviv there's this play upon words when it's, I don't speak Hebrew, but I learned that tov means good, but so the motto of the city is tov lov, which means tough love, but tov lov, but that. So like dirtying up Arendt's polis, which raises another question of what do we do with the countryside? Like we had that conversation in the car afterwards and in subsequent meetings. Is that something that only holds true for the metropolitan, where the rural will always be feel excluded from the games that people seem to be in the city, and everyone on the outside would be excluded? I don't know. Then we can go back to Hannah Arendt and her ideas of town halls, that maybe even and especially in a small village, the moment people get some kind of game on in the town hall, maybe it's the very same thing. Yeah, there's be something to be. Yeah. But it's also, the interesting thing is that the polis, the city, is never a given. The city must be reborn. Like a city in which people where there's war is no longer a city. A city exists insofar as it's being performed. New York only exists insofar as people are rude to each other in the street. If that ever stopped being fun, when it's just about gentrification and you are not supposed to be here, then the city no longer exists. You know what I mean? It's like the city needs to be constantly rejuvenated and revivified by this game of conflict. The moment the game is off, the city's dead. Yeah? And I have this horrible and this strange memory of, I don't know the U.S. that well, and I don't want to be the guy explaining the country to the people in the country. Well, it's a strange memory of being in Miami where my partner was having a residency, and we were on this kind of artist residency building. And on the side of the street where the building was, you had a lot of hipsters kind of sipping cappuccino, white. On the other side of the street, you had people kind of shooting up black. And there was a police car parked in the middle to make sure that people from the one side of the street don't come over to the other side of the street. In that moment, the city is dead. The polis no longer exists. It cannot be performed. We can no longer have a chat, a fight, a joke together. That's the moment when the city can no longer be performed. There is division, there's war, then also the city is dead. I don't know, for me, the attraction to these kind of vernacular models is, as you said, it allows us to maybe reimagine very fundamental things, but without taking recourse to the big narratives. Yeah. At the same time, I think by talking about attractors or appeal, for me it's always the question, like big narratives, they don't necessarily immediately connect to everyday life. You need someone or something to wave the big plane down, to kind of that which in cinema studies is called the suture, that something that binds the thing together with your imagination. And I feel on that level you have these attractors. They tell you, they give you a feeling that, oh my God, this is about me. And I'm just, my suspicion is that one of the big attractors that makes people feel like, oh my God, it's a big story, but it's actually about me, is that sense of the fateful. Yes, you can be excited by, oh my God, I could be part of the Justice League if I could only fly and had superpowers, or at least had some bats on my side. I could be, wow. There's like you can get a kid excited about, being better. That is definitely something that gets you into the story. But at the same time, this kind of sense, oh no, this is about me. That is someone willing to get down with me, live and die with me. Is down in the dirt with me. It's another powerful attractor. It's not the story, but it's what connects me to the story. And then once the story is up and running, we still have to decide where to take it. And my feeling is there is a story that takes it towards closure, false certainty, and mortality. Like the army of the dead is approaching. Again, Game of Thrones. Yeah, it's the army of the dead against the living, or the old voters against the young. This scenario currently plays itself out in so many ways of saying a certainty of something like coal is dead. Working in coal mines means you're gonna kill yourself with what you breathe in. Why would you want to opt against new forms of green technology, if not because it would make you give you the certainty that people have always been dying this death. I will be dying the same death as my father and grandfather. So on the one hand, this is part of the big narrative, and that takes either the turn towards death or I think the turn towards the risk of life, and then I'm back with Hannah Arendt. But what connects the story to everyday life are these kind of strange attractors. I mean, it's great when you get a little bit into this the way. I mean, I brought up Heidegger. Arendt and Heidegger were a couple for a very brief time, and it's sometimes in her political writing it seems like she tries to spin his empire of dirt, his kind of empire of death, like life. The truth of life is death, Heidegger. And Arendt saying the opposite. No, the truth of life is life. He says, life receives its definition from the end. She says, no, it takes its direction from its beginning. Politics is the risk of a beginning among strangers in trade or whatever. I don't know who you are, but I'm going to risk to begin something with you. That's what she says is the constant risk of politics. So again, we're on the big on the level of the big narrative. When someone says definition through death, the other through life. But I'm trying to think what brings them together is the attraction of the existential, and the other is that a lot of the time the patriarchal narrative has dominated the reading of the existential. It's this one day, my son, all of this will be yours. And God knows how many Hollywood plots work along this narrative. Yeah? Inheritance constructed as the patriarchal handover. And even a film like Blade Runner that kind of complicates that, the new one, I guess, maybe people have seen it. It's still kind of riffing on the attraction of like the father to son, the legitimate, credible handover of power. How can we... What's the mother to son, mother to daughter? What's that kind of lineage? Not just as a big story, but as a model of legitimate, of credible authority. There's such a strong link of the faithful to this idea of authority against, again, Arendt, who says, authority is something that legitimizes power, that renders power credible, but it's fundamentally something that comes from the people. So what love is there to be given that renders a figure a credible authority? It's a very common thing, artists, speakers, this sense of like, what can you invest me with a certain sense of authority? by virtue of listening to me or bearing with me, how to interpret that role. What imaginary are there for interpreting the role of the person who speaks and says something with appeal? And in that sense, all these authority figures are maybe not just leaders, from Araya to Khaleesi, but it's actors, it's speakers who are rendered credible by interpreting their role in a certain way that makes it clear that they're actually partaking in the struggles of life in a particular way. So it's leadership in the big story, but maybe on a simple daily life level, it's just simply what models of authority do we have? What would it mean for a figure to be credible as an actor, or as somebody who would you follow or listen to, if even for a moment, just within a given situation? So in that sense, it's a way of saying reimagining the faithful is also reimagining something, the compelling sense that for a moment allows you to accept someone as an authority, not just in the key of father to son or scientific expertise, but just simply like momentary credibility. That for a moment that seems to be talking to me. What roles how do we reinterpret that if we don't want to play the old games? And I'm saying that, being obviously the white guy, then can I carry this microphone back out? Anyone else? Yep.
So I guess during your talk you made this proposition, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the proposition that you suggested is that like communicating the message of progress, which leads toward life, through the language or at least the attitude of faith, which leads toward death, right? So I don't have much trouble to understand or reimagine this proposition in the Western culture specifically, but I have a hard time to think about this proposition in the culture, within the culture that I'm coming from, in the Middle East, which is still stuck in this kind of like binary values. The binary values are not deconstructed in the Middle Eastern culture like what we have in the Western culture, because as soon as you start to talk about the language of death or the language of faith, you're going to be delegitimized to show any further act toward life, because you are either this one or that one. You're not in between. You cannot use the language of one in order to communicate the other one. Even like, for example, in Islamic practice, especially the Shia section, when you talk about death or fate, you are going to actually go to the end of it until you wait for someone, an emancipator, to actually reappear and also actually free the whole world after you completely destroyed. Yeah. So until you are not completely destroyed or dead, you're not expecting any progress or life within that culture. While in the Western culture, you propose that it is possible to have the attitude of fate or death at least, but move toward life and progress. Yeah. So how can I reimagine this proposition in such cultures, like, for example, in Islamic culture or Middle Eastern culture?
No, first, quick comment. What I was trying to say, that some charismatic leftists, in a certain way, in a way that is actually quite corrupt, had a way of having it both ways. Like speaking of progress, but somehow suggesting that they were not necessarily good while promising it. So that you have a strange credibility being produced by, on the one hand, sharing a sense of deficiency in a jovial way, while on the other hand, precisely because of that, rendering the promise of improvement credible, because you're not actually claiming to promise this from a position where you're better than everybody. No, you're not. but that's why you can embody a certain horizon of improvement from being down with the people, something like that, which is a sense of having it both ways, of even bigottery, if you will. And that's what I was trying to say, like, I don't know, can we look at Khaleesi as someone who's not just a kind of, dandy playboy patriarch saying like, hey, like a leftist playboy, but somebody who can sort of speak with credibility from the position of crisis, but still thinking towards an improvement where you're not already kind of on the side of I am already so much better. Yeah. That's the first part. With Islamic cultures, I think I remember a quote by the painter and poet Etel Adnan from Beirut, and she was saying like, she's saying, the men around me, they're all so obsessed with the sacred, and so they all want to give their gift, and that means to sacrifice their life to the higher cause, and that's death. Yeah. So where the obsession with the set is becoming a saint, becoming sacred through dying and reaching that field of value through the sacrifice as a legitimation of your persona, which I guess a lot of rock and roll subcultures also have. No, you only acquire legitimacy when you've died for it. It's an obsession with the sacred, turning your body into a sacred substance, and which is irreversible, and no one can then contest your value if you've died for it. Sacrifice as opposed to the honor, obsession with the sacred. At the same time, I've learned a lot from one of the students I've been working with in Oslo called Ronak Moshtagi from Tehran. And apart from the fact that she was saying, in Tehran, if you make a driving license, you just have to learn how to curse. That you cannot drive a car in Tehran without knowing the art of like shouting obscenities at your fellow drivers. So a lot of the thinking about kind of urban convivial rudeness, I think I also took from her and her description of the joy of living in Tehran. It's a very metropolitan city where traffic is horrible, and it might just be the next best thing to New York in terms of this culture of urban rudeness. So we just say that you don't need to be sacred, you just need to know the current language of abuse to get from one point to the other in the city. And then another story that I have from her, which is beautiful story of the corruption of the poetic in Islamic poetry. Apparently, I'm going to pronounce this wrongly because I obviously don't speak any Farsi, but there's I think the figure of the Sagi, which is kind of it's a muse, but also very close to what in the Greek culture would be in the Pan. Like basically the little god who gets the sub-god who gets the party started by getting everyone drunk. And if I understand her correctly, it is a trope in Persian poetry that the poem starts with the invocation of the Sagi. Say like, Sagi, come, make me drunk. And if the Sagi graces you with his presence and you get drunk, at the end of the poem you can say, like, it wasn't me. The Sagi made me write it. Yeah. So it's a way of, it's not sacred, it's just it's the grotesque, it's the other direction. To say like you maneuver yourself poetically into a field where you're not good irreversibly, but where you're actually bad. You speak of desire, you speak of all these entanglements, but in the end you can always say, don't blame me, it was the Sagi. Yeah? And that's a sense of poetic license through a kind of poetically induced corruption. That is the essence of poetry, and hence the counter discourse to the irreversible sacred, where you are dead, and then on the other side, and your value cannot be challenged. You in poetry is like, of course, it's going to be contestable, but you just have this. You have someone on your side, which is the corrupter, which is the muse of the Sagi. And a friend of mine from Tehran also like. Living in Berlin, he said, like, very often when you go out, when alcohol is officially forbidden, when you go to a party and you among friends, you say, who's going to be the Sagi tonight? Meaning, who's going to be procuring the alcohol and make sure that the party... So it's a vernacular figure at the heart of the game, which is poetry. and maybe without knowing that much, just learning from the people who are supposedly my students. But I would say maybe a counter discourse to the death cult of the sacred is maybe the corruption of poetry.
So what you heard first of all is completely correct, and you actually reiterated and very correctly. But you mean that there is always, usually there is a mediator in between that facilitates that kind of corruption?
Yeah, I've never thought about it. I have to think about it. I mean, like, and the game. I mean, it's the whole thing that I feel like, even though we are in a complete media age, the whole idea of mediumicity is the one thing that's the big blind spot. Everybody deals with media, but I think for me the game is the medium, something that allows for the immediacy of war and marriage or something like that to be suspended in a game. This is an idea of the medial. There is something in between which displaces it, suspends it, and brackets it. I feel that's just strange. Maybe it's just me getting old, but like the strange thing of people constantly using medium, and in that very act losing the sense of mediumicity, like of a generation who no longer wants to play the game, who wants just to show up and win it. Yeah. So where do I have to press to get what I want? Yeah. So like, but there no one. It's all about like an understanding of politics, diplomacy is all about the game of the mediation. And hence I think a lot of anti-intellectualism is a lot about kind of who are these people who complicate things, the press, by just looking at it from different perspectives. Why can we not just say this is this and this is that? So I think bringing the game back on is also bringing back respect for mediumicity or something like that. There's one text that I feel like I always need to read. I haven't. I think it's either Lenin or Stalin. I think it's Lenin writing a dismissal of diplomacy as being essentially a middle class bourgeois. Like the middle class has invented all of these games that dilute politics. Among them, diplomacy. It's a game of lies and it's of mediators who stop things from happening. But of course, he loses the baby with the bathwater, because often politics is not about making things happen. That's war. Very often, it's about stopping things from happening. War. Yeah. So it's respect for the mediator. Don't shoot the pianist. Don't shoot the messenger. And allowing for people to understand that kind of suspension, which makes everything seemingly complicated, takes a hell of a lot of time. What did Bush said? A dictatorship would be a hell of a lot easier, yeah, because you don't have the trouble with the middleman. So for me, kind of there is something between game, medium, mediator, allowing for a moment of suspense that doesn't directly get you to the goal, but involves complicated ceremonies, invoking the spirit of. It takes a hell of a lot of time. I mean, politics is tedious. And I think all of these things somehow go together. And in that sense, I think like in political argument that art kind of always makes is look at the medium. Like politics is medium specific. It needs a mediator. So appreciation for the act of mediation. For the, yeah.
So when you say bring the game back,
yeah.
can I interpret it as bring the mediator back?
Yeah, or being the respect or the basic understanding for that back. When in a lot of vernacular culture, it's always there where the mediator is maybe the hairdresser, the cab driver, the person at the corner store. Somebody who's the mediator of urban life. Where do you get the jokes? Where do you play the back and forth? Well, you go into the gas station. You are like or to the hairdresser who knows the talk of town. These are the places where the city lives. It's the barber shop or something like that, where you play the game. There's the Spiel, the Chutzpah, a particular way of. I mean, it's the cult of the barber shop as well, where the barber is the city. Because he's the person who makes Brooklyn happen, something like that. And I feel a lot of the times when people think of intellectuals For me, I think it's the person in the barber shop, or the person, the cab driver, the bartender, and all of these figures who are basically the mediators of urban life, the media. Yeah. Which again, I'm also not really in a position to say. Yeah, but it's that imaginary of somebody who channels the electricity of the city, and is thereby is the pure embodiment of the city, if you will. But not necessarily by being in a position of privilege. Kate, yeah. Thank you.